Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the book of Job, and you may wish to start at chapter 1, but as you can imagine, you might need to flick your way through the book as we proceed. Now, you don't need to look very far to see that we live in a world that is characterized by suffering. Some of us only need to look at our own lives to realize that. Others of us only need to look as far as our immediate family to see that, while others of us are made aware of that day in and day out in the workplace. And if you don't fit into any of those categories and are therefore still blissfully unaware of the suffering that characterizes life in this world, then watching the occasional news bulletin might be helpful, because there is plenty of it taking place across our world tonight. And that is why our attempts to evangelize are often met with a question about suffering. Have you noticed that? How many times have you tried to share the gospel and the response has been, "But if there is a God, then why is there so much suffering in the world?" And what you often discover is that although it is only a certain type of person who wants to argue about science and evolution and the separation between atoms and molecules and all that sort of thing, some niche stuff, most people will have questions about suffering, because suffering affects most people in one way or another, both Christians and non-Christians alike. And therefore it is not only the unbeliever who sometimes struggles to come to terms with the idea of suffering. The Christian believer can often struggle with the concept as well. And that's precisely why the book of Job was written. Which leads me to my first point this evening, and that is from chapters 1 and 2. And there we see the reality of life in God's world. The reality of life in God's world. Now, a quick flick through the book of Job will reveal, especially if you're using a modern translation like the NIV, a quick flick through the book will indicate that most of the book is written as poetry, and very little of it is written as prose or narrative. And the reason for God, in his wisdom, given us a book on suffering, the bulk of which is in poetry, is perhaps because, as J.I. Packer has said, poems communicate not just from head to head, but from heart to heart. And so apart from a few verses in chapter 32 and the latter part of chapter 42, the only prose in the entire book is in chapters 1 and 2, and it is there that we are introduced to the man Job himself. The opening verses reveal him to be a worshipper of the living God. Verse 1 tells us this man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Now, that is not to say that he was perfect or sinless, but he was a man whose faith in God was accompanied by regular repentance of sin, and therefore he was a man whose faith in God was accompanied by a consistent, godly way of living. And far from being a religious hypocrite, Job was a man of religious and moral integrity. That is not only the historian's assessment of Job, that is also God's assessment of him. And we know that because in a conversation between God and Satan, we hear God saying, verse 8, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on the earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." That is God's assessment of Job. But then the opening verses of the book not only tell us about Job's integrity in life, they also tell us about Job's success in life. Verse 3, he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And that combination of devotion to God and evident success in life, that combination leads Satan to the conclusion that Job's religion is entirely motivated by self-interest, i.e., he's in it because of what he's getting out of it. His accusation against Job in verses 9 to 11 is that he only fears God because God is being so good to him. Stretch out your hand, verse 11. This is Satan speaking to God. Stretch out your hand, verse 11, and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. In other words, says Satan, cut off the supply line of all the good things in life, and you'll soon see the real Job. He won't be worshipping you then, says the devil. And in response to that accusation, God says, verse 12, very well then, let's face up to the challenge. Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. The result being that in verse 14, Job loses his oxen and donkeys. In verse 16, he loses his sheep and servants. In verse 17, he loses his camels. In verse 19, he loses all his kids. All his property and possessions and children lost. And don't forget, it was all lost in one day. One day. What a traumatic day in the life of Job. And what was his response? Verse 21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And as far as God was concerned, chapter 2, verse 3, Job still fears God and shuns evil. He still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. But, says Satan in chapter 2, verse 4, skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. In other words, says the devil, well, that's all very well, but look, all that you've touched in Job's life so far is his property, his possessions, and his offspring. You haven't really done anything to the man himself. And so the next challenge is, touch him. And so, verse 7, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery. No dermatologist for Job. He took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His condition was so bad that his wife says to him in verse 9, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. And in reply, Job says, you are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Now, what we have to remember is that although you and I know the circumstances behind Job's suffering, although you and I know the background to his suffering, although you and I know the explanation, Job doesn't. He was completely unaware of those conversations between his God and the devil, and therefore, and this is true throughout the whole book, he doesn't have a clue as to why he is suffering as he is. He doesn't know the explanation. He doesn't know the background to his suffering. And therein lies an important lesson for us. And that is, yes, there may be times when the cause of suffering in our lives can be identified or can be explained. But there may be other times when there is simply no apparent explanation as to why we are going through what we are going through. Job's experience in these opening chapters demonstrates that. But then what both Job and us do know, even at this point in the book, is that his suffering, it wasn't the result of something wrong that he had done. It wasn't the result of something sinful in his life. It wasn't the result of something foolish, a foolish choice that he had made in life. What you have in the book of Job is an example of innocent suffering. And let me explain what I mean by that. There is a sense in which all suffering is the result of sin. Prior to Adam and Eve sinning in the Garden of Eden, there was no suffering in this world. All the suffering that we see in our world today, and all the suffering that we experience in our lives, is ultimately a consequence of their rebellion back there in the Garden of Eden and our subsequent rebellion against our Creator throughout our lives. But that does not mean that you can trace every instance of suffering back to a particular sin on the part of the sufferer. You cannot do that. There is such a thing as innocent suffering. Job's suffering is not the result of some sin that he has committed. There is such a thing as innocent suffering. The experience of Job in chapters 1 and 2 demonstrates that, and the teaching of Jesus many years later reinforces that. For example, in the opening verses of John chapter 9, we read of Jesus' disciples coming across a man who was blind from birth. And their question was, they saw this man blind from birth and they thought, somebody sinned. Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? And then replied, Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. That's not the explanation to his condition. But this happened so that the work of God may be displayed in his life. There is such a thing as innocent, and from a human point of view, inexplicable suffering. That is the reality of life in God's world. Secondly, the fundamental flaw in our logic, and that takes us from chapter 3 to chapter 37. The fundamental flaw in our logic. Now, the opening 2 chapters, they not only introduce us to Job, they also introduce us to his 3 friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. You'll see them introduced at the very end of chapter 2. There is another man who appears in chapters 32 to chapter 37, a man called Elihu, but we don't have time to look at him this evening, and so we will restrict our time to the famous, or rather the infamous 3. You may have known the phrase, Job's comforters. On seeing Job, they were horrified. Chapter 2 verse 12 says they could hardly recognize him and they began to weep aloud. Verse 13 tells us they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Eventually, it is Job who breaks the silence in chapter 3. And what he's essentially saying in this chapter is that he wishes he had never been born. That's how bad his situation is. That's how desperate his circumstances are. That's how painful his suffering has become. He wishes he had never been born. Although he does not curse God, as Satan suspected he would do, and as his wife told him to do, although he does not curse God, he does curse the day of his birth. Verse 11, chapter 3, verse 11, why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Verse 26, I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil. Such is Job's anguish and pain. And to make matters even worse, his three friends decide to break their silence and answer him. And so what you have from here through to chapter 31 is three cycles of speeches where each of his three friends try to put Job right, followed by Job's response. And although we don't have time, obviously, to look at them in detail, I will try and highlight a few things that might give you a flavour of what they were saying. For example, in chapter 4, verse 3, Eliphaz says, think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you and you are discouraged. It strikes you and you're dismayed. In other words, says Eliphaz, why is it that you have been able to help others in the past who've been going through difficult times, but you cannot help yourself now that you are in a time of trouble? What a question to ask a man in his situation. That wasn't a great start, but it only gets worse. Verse 6. Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? In other words, says Eliphaz, if you were the blameless, devout man that we thought you were, Job, surely you would be able to rise above your difficult circumstances, would you not? And the fact that you can't seems to suggest that you're not the man that we thought you were. And that's not just a suspicion because you can't handle your sufferings. That's a suspicion because of the sufferings themselves. Verse 7. Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plough evil and those who sow trouble reap it. And although you get slight variations to the arguments of the three friends throughout the next 30 chapters, that is essentially the nub of their argument. God is uncompromisingly just, they said, infinitely more righteous than us, verse 17, and therefore living in God's world, we get what we deserve. A man reaps what he sows. Now, one of the challenges in reading this long middle section of the book is that there is often an element of truth in what the three friends are saying. And here is one example of that. God is infinitely righteous and just. And as the book of Proverbs teaches us, chapter 22, verse 8, and as Paul will remind us in Galatians 6, verse 7, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. But Eliphaz and his friends have made two mistakes in their understanding of God's justice. Firstly, they don't appreciate the time frame in which God's justice is worked out. Yes, in the long term, a man does reap what he sows, and that is why Paul's application of that principle in Galatians 6 is that the one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction, while the one who sows to please the Spirit, from that Spirit will reap eternal life. Paul is emphasizing the long-term, eternal implications of reaping what we sow. Whereas Eliphaz and his friends assume that God's justice is instantaneous and that good is immediately rewarded in this life and wrong is immediately punished in this life. And that misunderstanding of God's justice led to their second mistake, which was that they could not accommodate the idea of innocent suffering within their moral and theological framework. As far as they were concerned, God operated on a rapid, obvious, and mechanical tit-for-tat system of recompense. You do good, you're immediately rewarded by God. You do wrong, you're immediately punished by God. And that's why they're convinced that Job is in this mess as a result of some sin that he has committed. He's been disciplined. He's been chastised. He's been punished by God. And they will spend the next 30 chapters subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, telling him so. Trying to get him to open up. Trying to get him to open up and to own up to the wrong that he must have done for this to have happened in his life. And consequently, Job will have to spend the next 30 chapters defending himself against their false accusations. For example, chapter 6, verse 29, relent, do not be unjust. This is Job speaking to his friends. Do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake. And so not only has he lost his possessions, not only has he lost his property, not only has he lost his children, not only has he lost his health, his great concern is that if he goes along with what they are saying, he's also going to lose his integrity. Do you see how cruel a distorted theology can be? The very time someone needs the help and the encouragement and the comfort of a friend, they're made to feel even worse by the faulty, distorted theology of a so-called friend. That is what Job is expressing in chapter 6, verse 14. A despairing man, and he was a despairing man. A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers are undependable as intermittent streams. But then it was not only Job's friends, and it was not only Jesus' disciples who were quick to draw a straight line between sin and suffering. It still happens today. And especially so, not only, but especially so in the various shades of prosperity gospel that has permeated so much of so-called Christianity. The reason you're ill, they say, is because you have a lack of faith. The reason you're poor, they tell us, is because you're not putting God first in your life. Many years later, and that can still be the fundamental flaw in our logic. People who are determined to draw a straight line between suffering and sin. And even if there's not much danger of us expressing such flawed theology, our logic can still be flawed in that we assume that there must be some explanation behind someone's suffering, and consequently we feel obliged to come up with an explanation. When all the time, as Job's experience demonstrates, all the time, there may be no explanation from a human perspective, and therefore we would be better not to try and give one. As Mr. Carson says, it would have been wonderful if one of the friends had simply put an arm around Job's shoulder and wept with him, saying, "We love you, Job. We do not pretend to understand, but we love you and we'll do whatever we can for you. End of quote. But instead, they felt obliged to explain his suffering. And sadly, they explained it very badly. That is often the fundamental flaw in our logic. Thirdly and finally, and you'll be glad to know we're almost through the book. Thirdly and finally, the God who is God, even in our suffering, chapters 38 to 42. Now, unlike the modern skeptic, who thinks that suffering disproves the existence of God, that is often the argument, Job, in spite of his suffering, Job continues to think and live and argue as a believer. And in one sense, it is his belief in God that makes his suffering all the more difficult for him to understand. If Job could have dismissed his circumstances as nothing more than an unfortunate coincidental rearrangement of molecules, then that might have been easier to accept in the short term. Although it wouldn't have provided much comfort or hope whatsoever in the long term. But rather than do that, Job continues to wholeheartedly believe in God, a God who is sovereign, and therefore a God who is in control of what goes on within his world. And so, that being the case, Job has to grapple. He has to grapple not only with how his friends are treating him, but with how his God appears to be treating him. And that is undoubtedly the bigger issue for Job. Which is why we hear him say in chapter 19, I realise I gave the verse 38 to 42, but if you just flick back to chapter 19 for a moment, that is why we hear him say in chapter 19, verse 6, that if he has been treated unjustly, then rather than putting that down to bad luck, as an unbeliever would do, Job is beginning to think that perhaps it is God who has wronged him. Though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no justice. He, i.e. God, has blocked my way so that I cannot pass. He has shrouded my paths in darkness. He has stripped me of my honour and removed the crown from my head. He tears me down on every side till I am gone. He uproots my hope like a tree. His anger burns against me. He counts me among his enemies. Living in God's world, not in a purely material world that is governed by nothing other than scientific laws, but living in God's world, a world that is governed by the sovereignty and rule of God. The only explanation that Job can come up with for his sufferings is that God is against him. That is what Job honestly thinks. That is how Job honestly feels. And yet, no sooner has he expressed his honesty about God in the opening verses of chapter 19, and he expresses his trust in the very same God in verse 25 when he says, famous verse from the book of Job, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Did you hear that? On the one hand, he simply cannot understand why God should be treating him as he is in the present. And yet, on the other hand, he has every confidence that there is coming a day, and he longs for that future day when his Redeemer God will return to this earth and will vindicate him. And so, unlike his three friends with their immediate short-term implementation of divine justice, Job is expressing his confidence in the future long-term outworking of divine justice. But as to how he should see God's dealings with him in the present, well, that brings us to chapter 38, where God speaks to Job for the very first time in the book. Chapter 38, verse 2. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Now, throughout the book, Job has been demanding answers from God, but now it is God who is demanding answers of Job. Verse 4. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me, if you understand, who marked off the heavens? Surely you know, Job, do you not? Who stretched a measuring line across it? It's a series of questions right through to the end of chapter 39 that reveal the great gulf between the Creator and the creature. It's a series of questions that reveal the greatness or the bigness of God and the relative smallness of Job. It's a series of questions that are meant to make Job realize that he could never have done what God has done. To a man who was tempted to think that perhaps God was getting the running of this world and the running of his life a little bit wrong, these questions were meant to make him think whether he could do a better job of running things than God is currently doing. Or to quote the actual words of God himself in chapter 40, verse 2, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. And in reply, Job says, verse 4, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. From chapter 40, verse 6 through to the end of chapter 41, God speaks to Job again, and he's reminding him of the limited power of man, and in sharp contrast, the limitless power of God. His infinite power over creation, over both the physical, material aspects of creation and the spiritual aspects of creation, and his infinite wisdom in running his universe from day to day. God is revealing to Job. You read it, chapters 38 to chapters 42, God is revealing to Job something of his majesty and his greatness and his glory and his wisdom. And although Job does not get a specific answer to his specific question as to why he's suffering as he is humbly brought to the conclusion that if God can be trusted to run the universe in all its complexity, then surely he can be trusted with the events and the circumstances of Job's little life, even on those occasions when Job does not quite understand what God is doing. That is why we hear Job say, chapter 42, verse 2, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now, please note, Job's repentance on this occasion was not for some sin which he committed prior to experiencing his suffering. It's very easy to get to the end of the book and read of Job repenting and think to yourself, there you go, the three friends were right all along. He wasn't repenting of something that he had. No. He's not repenting of those sins which his friends accused him of. Job was entirely innocent, and he was right to maintain his innocence throughout the entire book. It's him who was right. It's the three friends who got it all wrong. But instead, what he is repenting of is his attitude towards God throughout his suffering. Yes, there is a place for asking why, as the psalmist demonstrates on numerous occasions. You read the Psalms. Why, O Lord, do you stand afar off? Why do you do this? Why? There is a place for asking why. But there is a difference between a humble why and demanding of God an explanation as if he were answerable and accountable to us. And it seems that Job has come to the conclusion that he has perhaps overstepped that boundary in trying to hold God to account, demanding of him answers and explanations as to why this has happened and why that should have happened. And if we were able to ask Job what we can learn from his experience so that we can respond rightly in times of suffering, then I suspect his advice would be verse 5. Don't lose sight of your God. As he reflects on his own experience, he says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. In other words, says Job, don't lose sight of your God. Don't forget what I had to learn through chapters 38 to 41. Don't forget his greatness. Don't forget his might. Don't forget his awesomeness. Don't forget his infinite wisdom as revealed in the creation of this universe and in his day-to-day running of it. Don't forget those things. And if your God is so great and so powerful and so wise that he can be trusted to keep this universe ticking over and going from day to day in all its great complexity, if he can be trusted to do that, then surely you can trust him to order the events and the circumstances of your little life. That would be his advice to us from where he stood in redemptive history. But if he were living today, I'm sure he would want to add something. And I say that because since Job's day, God has revealed his wisdom and his power and his care and concern for his people in other ways, and even greater ways. And so the next time you find yourself grappling with the question, is God for me or against me? As Job was grappling with. The next time you find yourself asking that question, then by all means read the book of Job. That's why it's in the Bible. Read the book of Job, and especially chapters 38 to 42. But in addition to reading the book of Job, read also the closing verses of Romans chapter 8. And you will see that the supreme way in which God has demonstrated that he is for us is in the giving of his own dear Son on our behalf. You see, another problem with the theology of Job's three friends is that by ruling out the possibility of innocent suffering in this world, they left very little room in their worldview for the greatest intervention of God in the history of our world. And that was the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross. The next time you're tempted to doubt the reality of innocent suffering, then look at the cross. And there you'll see the only truly innocent person who has ever lived, suffering more than anyone else ever has, in that he who knew no sin became sin for us. And if you are a Christian tonight, then as a result of the innocent Jesus suffering the judgment of God in your place, then you can be sure that God is for you, regardless of how difficult the circumstances of your life may be. And if God is for us in that way and to that extent, to the extent that he gave up his own son for us, if God is for us in that way and to that extent, says Paul in Romans 8 verse 31, then who can possibly be against us? And the next time you meet your accuser, whether it be your own oversensitive conscience falsely accusing you, or whether it be some of those badly taught so-called friends that Job had, or whether it be the accuser of God's people, i.e. the devil, the next time you meet your accuser, then just remember that if God is for us, as demonstrated not only in his infinitely wise running of the universe, but if God is for us as demonstrated at the cross, then, says Paul, who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? Because it is God who justifies. 3 lessons from the book of Job. Firstly, the reality of life in God's world. Secondly, the fundamental flaw in our logic. And thirdly, the God who is God. And we ought to let him be God, even in our suffering.